But for the meantime, welcome again to Bother the Father. We are here. Man, I can't remember. I don't even know how many sessions we've had. This has been over a year. I know that much. So thanks for sticking with us. So again, this is just an open forum, open discussion, any topic whatsoever, personal matters of faith or whatever. So I'm your parish priest at your disposal to answer the questions as best my ability. And if I don't know, I'll go find out or try to find out as best my ability. Okay, so if you didn't say, I put it in the description or the comments of the videos. The question came up last week about the relics that are actually inside the altar at St. Peter's Basilica. And as I suspected, again, I wanted to confirm this, but I talked to some experts and got some input, and it was a tough question because a lot of people didn't know. And the answer came that because there are the remains of St. Peter under the altar, everything's in the crypt, that's determined to be the reverence of those relics. So there is no altar stone in the papal altar in St. Peter's Basilica. There are no actually relics inside the actual altar. They're all underneath the altar in the crypt below. So good question. Excellent. Yeah. So I put that in the description, kind of more detail from an expert who told me what's up with that, and so you can go back and look at those if you feel so inclined. Otherwise, if there are any questions, the floor is open.
And am I correct? We don't know what relics might be in our altar.
We still don't know what relics are in our altar. What's so fascinating about that is we have quite a few relics that are in the sacristy itself. We have them in the safe. There's some actually kind of art in the sacristy now, and we actually have documentation. So to validate, is the door locked up there?
I guess somebody closed the door.
In other words, to validate a first or second class relic, there's paperwork from Rome that validates that, right? So there's actually a documentation that's printed by the Vatican in Latin that actually says what the relic is, who it comes from, and all that good stuff, and also who it's given to. Every relic we have upstairs, we have documentation for. The relics inside the altar of St. Gabriel, we don't know. We have no documentation, which is odd because you would think that probably would be kept somewhere. And I'm not sure if it was kept or maybe it was at some point, and then eventually it got lost, or maybe someone took it, didn't know what it was, and threw it away. I don't know. But the only way you can find out now is to actually pull out the altar stone, which isn't impossible, but it is also, you probably cause more damage by doing that.
Where is the altar stone?
So if you look on top of the mensa, on the top of the altar, it's actually in the center.
Okay.
And so in order, you have to pry it out, right? You'd have to pry it out in order to actually get it up. There's no way you can push it because it's all stone. So you could cause more damage to the altar, or damage itself to the altar, than maybe you want to by doing that. So,
there's a written description or something of the relics that are there.
So when relics come, so first and second class, I should say first and second class relics, they're always validated by Rome. So in other words, they're always accompanied with paperwork saying who the saint is, what it is of the saint, and then who it's given to. We have documentation for every relic we have at St. Gabriel except for the ones in the altar.
How many are there?
Well, traditionally there are 3, but there doesn't have to be. So I've been told there's 3. I don't know if that's ever been validated.
Every altar has 3? Every altar has relics.
Not necessarily.
No?
Not necessarily.
Oh.
So any church built probably after 1955 wouldn't necessarily have to have relics in it.
Why did it before 1955? Why is it a magic year?
Rich, you want anything on it? So it's not necessarily a magic year. How should I put this?
They're all spoken for.
Well, no. It's the fact that so in the extraordinary form of the mass before 1970, or I should say 1965, maybe. It was required by the rubric, by the general instruction of the Roman Missal, that every altar would have a relic. Starting in about the 1950s, there were some, what's a fair word? Experimentation, maybe, organic trials of liturgically of how things maybe should be leading up to the Second Vatican Council, where there was a call for reform of liturgy, and that did occur. What's very interesting, though, is when you read a lot of the document, like if you read the document that came from Vatican II, Sacrament of Marriage, a lot of the stuff that was done was never actually promulgated or validated or actually put forth by the documents of Vatican II. So, for instance, in the extraordinary for the Mass, the altar would be against the tabernacle. There would be no space there because the Mass is always done what we call ad orientem, which just means towards the east. And that doesn't mean that every church is oriented towards the east. It just means liturgical east, the tabernacle, meaning the Son of God, the rising sun. There's symbolism there, right?
So wherever the tabernacle is, that's east.
That's considered liturgical east, right? And so ad orientem, the priest is always studying the Mass with everybody else towards the tabernacle, right? Mm-hmm. Around 1955, the altar started being moved away from the wall, away from the tabernacle, and then the priest would turn and face what we call pro populum, towards the people, right? And that was a change that was really kind of tested leading up to Vatican II. For those who maybe know, here in St. Louis, there was a great pioneer in that respect, Monsignor Hellriegel, who did a lot here in St. Louis trying to get ready for the council. And there's a lot of stuff that actually happened here in St. Louis, instrumented here in St. Louis. But nowhere in the documents of Vatican II will you say that the altar should be removed from the wall, from the tabernacle. It just was something that was kind of accepted and kind of kept on going. And churches were being built in the 1950s and 60s, and they were just being built that way without really any, how should I say, validation from Rome or the council or really bishops in general.
Did they say anything about facing the people at all?
No, not necessarily. Again, it was kind of accepted as that would be proper, being that if the mensa, if the altar is moved away from the wall, that there's merely more centralized on what the sacrifice happening on the altar. Again, that's less theologically sound, and also there was historical kind of backing with that the Novus Ordo that we have today that came out of Vatican II was thought to be a going back to the original, what they call house masses that would happen in the early church. So for the first couple centuries in the church, Mass was celebrated either at grave sites, right, tombs and crypts, or in particular people's houses, namely maybe the bishop, right, or another presbyter would actually celebrate the Mass in their house, right, gathered around a table with people maybe in the round or whatever. And so it wouldn't necessarily be ad orientem, because there also would be no tabernacle. You would only consecrate the amount that you need for that particular Mass, maybe to bring deacons and greens to the sick, that kind of stuff. So that was kind of the historical backing of it. That this was thought, well, by doing this, we're kind of going back to the original Masses that were done in the early parts of the church. And there's truth there. But Vatican II never actually promulgated that, right? So I think again we go back to this whole idea of the spirit of Vatican II compared to what actually Vatican II said, right? But it's just been kind of an accepted norm, and we know there's a term in canon law that's called MOS, M-O-S, and what that basically says is that for a particular lower T tradition in a particular parish or diocese or whatever, as long as the bishop knows about it and it's been done for at least 35 years, it then becomes canon law, right? So at this point, we're pushing 70 years since Vatican II, right? So the bishops have all known this, that this has been going on. At least the bishops here, Archbishop here in St. Louis, has known this since the time of Glennon on. And so, okay, again, with that historical backing, it seems proper. But that you won't find anything in Sacrosanctum Concilium stating it should be done that way. Now, the germ does specify what we call the general instruction of the Roman Missal, where the rubric comes from. So a lot of times you read the Missal, there's maybe some gaps. There's not everything is necessarily said in the missal. If you go back to the extraordinary form, there's a lot more detail in the rubric of the extraordinary form of Mass than there is now in the Novus Ordo. Now the germ, though, which is the governing document, would kind of specify certain things, like what color is appropriate for what day. It actually does say in there whether you're doing a pro populum or ad orientem, or how you actually should celebrate that Mass. It even kind of dictates whether you're celebrating Mass with the people, or if it's a priest and just an altar server. So they go through like different ways of actually the Mass can be celebrated in the germ. But that never came from Sacrament Concilium. Did that answer your question? Probably more needed there. But I want to get a full answer on that one.
On the subject of Vatican II, so my hairdresser, her sister is a nun, and she is self-proclaimed conservative Catholic. I don't know the difference because I'm new.
I say the Orthodox or unorthodox. I don't go conservative or liberals.
Well, she was saying last night lunch with her that I guess she's early 60s, and she was saying her generation, the catechism and Catholic teachings were more watered down because of Vatican II. She seemed to not have a super positive thought on Vatican II.
So I would maybe push back on that. So the catechism and teaching of the church there's always been consistent teaching of the church. Now, things have been developed, right? And there's a development of teaching. The teaching has never contradicted itself. There's always been the catechism and the teaching of the church that's been consistent throughout all of history. But there's been developments, like for instance in the Sacrament of Marriage, right? Initially, the Sacrament of Marriage was kind of thought to be it was instituted by Jesus Christ at the Feast of Cana. It was always had the sacramental, that grace that was given, but the goods of the sacrament were kind of developed over time. So it was kind of thought that the only reason to get married would be to overcome lust and also to promulgate children, right? Procreation, that's a great good. Over time, that was kind of developed and kind of teased out and more refined to say, well, actually, there are three goods in marriage. And there's also a hierarchy to that. So sacramentality, making Jesus part of that bond, is the first good. That's the primary good. That's the highest good. And because of that, the couple are unified in that bond, in that covenant. They become one flesh. And from that unification comes others. Right? Their love is so great, you want to create more of those, of yourselves, of each other, which is procreation. So you can see how that developed over like centuries, right? It wasn't really until maybe, even the unit of Acts, it probably wasn't teased out until maybe Pius IX, which was like, kind of the 19th century. So we see that now today, recently, just there was a development of doctrine when it comes to the death penalty, right? So for a long, long time, it was thought, well, the death penalty is, it can be justified in certain circumstances. Like, let's say, a lot of these I think were more theoretical. So what was always put out there was, well, let's say you have like a Bond villain who can't be like, retained as constant menace to society. There's no jail that can hold this person. They're just so diabolical they can get out of any situation and cause havoc to the common good. In that circumstance, and maybe only that circumstance, the death penalty may be warranted to actually keep the common good and keep the destruction down. That may be the only way to actually overcome that aggression, right? What Pope Francis has just promulgated, maybe that's been about 5 or 6 years ago now, is a change in the catechism to basically say, in modern society, practically speaking, there is no circumstance where someone cannot be detained permanently, even maybe for life. And that threat can be not constant anymore because of that. Right? That's a development of doctrine. That doesn't contradict anything that the church has taught. It's just more of like, because we developed as a society, practically speaking, there may not be a situation where that actually could occur, right? So we always want to keep that in mind when we're talking about the teaching of the church. Now, When it comes to Vatican II, I think what we have to make a distinction, and this is all, I always make this distinction, because we have to make a distinction of what Vatican promulgated and what was thought to be from Vatican II. I call it the spirit of Vatican II and the truth of Vatican II. So a lot of things we see today, like for instance, a misconception of say, well, the church got away with the whole not eating meat on Friday. Untrue. What the church said through the documents of Vatican II was, yeah, you know, the eating of meat on Friday can be replaced in a way if you were to do some form of penance on Friday instead. So in other words, yeah, you can have meat on Friday now, except for Lent, and we won't retain that tradition because of the sacrificial and the penitential nature of that season. But on any other Friday, yeah, okay, if you want to have a cheeseburger, fine, but you should do some other form of penance on that Friday in recognition of the day that our Lord died, the sacrifice of Jesus. We should also then perform some form of sacrifice.
That's gotten lost in the shuffle.
It certainly has. And that's what I'm saying. That the spirit of Vatican II was saying, oh yeah, you can eat all you want on Friday. That's no big deal. Well, if you read the documents, that's not what it says. A big one that I know caused a lot of consternation in this parish, as I've experienced, is the use of Latin in the liturgy. The use of Latin is still retained in Vatican II. What Vatican II says, though, is that, yeah, use of vernacular can be used for catechetical reasons. So in other words, if you want to teach what's going on in the Novus Ordo using the vernacular, great. But then the question is, well, okay, then when should we go back to Latin? When do people know enough to what's going on in the Novus Ordo to say, okay, I think we got an idea of what's happening here. Let's return to the mother tongue of the church. Let's return to the actual common language of the church. That's a good question, right? So I always want to put that in context because a lot of the stuff we say that Vatican II changed, it didn't, right? There's a mindset, there's a thought that it did, but when you read what came out of Vatican II, it does allow for certain things, development of things, but it doesn't really change anything that's been practiced before Vatican II. And I think that's where you get a lot of people, whether they consider themselves more orthodox or non-orthodox, you get a lot of misconception. Because on one side you get a lot of people, yeah, the Vatican II was the worst thing ever done, it changed the church radically. No, it didn't. And then the other side you get, oh, it's the best thing ever, it changed it for the best for progressive. No, it didn't. Right? So we want to be very clear about what it is. And I think I encourage anybody to go back and read the documents of Vatican II, and you'll make the same conclusions. Oh, wait, nothing really changed here. It just kind of gave us more allowances and more development. One thing that's also novel about Vatican II, but this isn't anything that was never done before. A lot of times when an ecumenical council meets, they promulgate something because they're answering some sort of question, and then they put out a bunch of what they call anathemas, right? So in other words, let's say like in Nicaea, for instance, the Second Vatican Council. The first one was Jerusalem. They said, okay, this whole thing about Arius, he's crazy. You know, Jesus was God and man. He wasn't created by the Father. He was with the Father from all time. So we have to, as a church, say that Jesus was both fully God, fully man. Anyone who claims the Arian heresy is anathema. Anathema sit, meaning they're cut off from the community. We call that excommunication, right? Again, another misconception too is the bishop does not excommunicate you, you excommunicate yourself. The bishop just declares you excommunicated, basically declares the truth that's already been done. So anyone who claimed the Arian heresy after Nicaea, they've excommunicated themselves from the church. Anathema sit. Vatican II didn't do that. Now, Vatican II wasn't the only one that never do that. There were other councils and synods that didn't do that. They were more developed for more pastoral issues. And that was the purpose of Vatican II, to address, okay, well, how does the church fit into this modern world we have today? What's our relationship with other Christian denominations? What's our relationship with Jews and Muslims and other maybe polytheistic organizations, right? How do we fit now in this world that's kind of developed in a time that is kind of mind staggering if you look at it? In this rapidly evolving world, what's the church have to say? That's the reason why it was actually convened. So a lot of the things came out of Vatican II were pastoral in nature. There weren't necessarily like these defined dogmas that came from it, right? So let me be very clear about that too. Make sense?
Interesting. When was Vatican II? What years?
62 to 65.
Because I was in high school,
Mm-hmm.
and I think senior year, the priest we had, it was so refreshing. You know, we went over to the school chapel, and he turned around, and we did in English, and oh my goodness, you know.
Yeah.
He snapped right into it.
Right. And I think part of it, because I mean, a lot of priests today, even, I mean, and I never knew him, but I mean, from my understanding, Monsignor Helbriegel was a great priest, a very holy priest, a very devout priest. And I think it's because of that influence why that kind of happened so quickly here in St. Louis. I mean, it's interesting, like Immaculate Heart of Mary, for instance, my parish, my home parish, that church was built in 1955. And that it was always built with the altar and the tabernacle away from each other. Well, that was 8 years before the council met. And I think that's probably because you had Monsignor Helbriegel, who was kind of advocating for these things. Again, not bad, but you won't see anything in the documents of Vatican II saying, okay, go ahead and do that.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Why would you advocate for that? Like, why would you want that to change? Is that
So
because
the
architectural reasons?
well, I think
or-
the theological reason, because it's more centralized on the sacrifice of the Mass. So not the tabernacle is important because that's where Jesus dwells, but the altar is really the focus of the liturgy. You notice that, like during Mass or during liturgy hours and liturgy in the sanctuary, we don't pay a lot of attention to the tabernacle. We pay a lot of attention to the altar because of that. Because in the liturgy, the central figure should be the altar. That represents the tomb of Jesus. That's where we're brought present to the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so the focus is now more on the altar than is really on the tabernacle. So it's a good theological reason. That's not wrong, right? But there's also maybe a critique that, well, now you're so disconnected from the tabernacle, the dwelling place of God, and where the sacrifice occurs. There should be an intimate unification of those things, right? Okay, I don't doubt that, and I wouldn't necessarily combat that. But the reason for that change is because, well, now the attention should be at the altar where the sacrifice is actually occurring. The sacrifice doesn't happen in the tabernacle. That's representative of the meeting tent of the Old Testament where God dwelled, and God does dwell there. Jesus does dwell there. But the sacrifice and everything happens on the altar, right? Some people think it's more centralized on the priest. I don't know if that's necessarily true. I think the idea is you're centralized more on the altar than the priest, right? Because that also was kind of a shift, kind of the spirit of Vatican II, that before the priest was the leader of the congregation in union with them. Everyone was facing the same direction towards God. In the Novus Ordo, now that can still happen in the Novus Ordo. The Novus Ordo can be celebrated ad orientem. The priest can celebrate towards the altar. That's okay. That's allowed in the germ. That's allowed in the missal.
Do that this Sunday and see the reaction.
Why did that cause such a reaction?
Well, I think, if you ever experienced the extraordinary form of the Mass, and here's, man, this is okay, this might happen a can of worms, but here we go. There was a misunderstanding, over time, there was kind of a misconception of what was actually happening. So if you were to go to extraordinary form of the Mass, let's say at Francis of Sales or anywhere else, that might be a bad example, but let's say you went to Mass in 1885, okay? And you're sitting there in the congregation, you don't say anything. The people in the congregation do not actually, there's no dialogue with the congregation. they're praying. They should be praying at that moment. They should be offering. They should also be exercising their priestly ministry as a common priest by offering spiritual sacrifice in the Mass, just like the priest offers the sacrifice of Jesus. That's always been taught by the Church. But what you would end up having is a lot of people may pray the Rosary during the Mass, or other devotionals during the Mass, or other things during the Mass, right? Maybe fall asleep during the Mass. Because there's not that really engagement with the congregation in the extraordinary form. The dialogue, everything happens within the sanctuary between the servers and the ministers. That's it. And so what Vatican tried to bring out in the Novus Ordo was this understanding of what we call active participation. And active participation is not like a ministry. It's not like you have to be a lector, you have to be an usher, you have to be a server, you have to be whatever. Active participation is an internal disposition towards what's happening in the Mass. It's really supposed to kind of put in context that priestly aspect we're all baptized into. That the lay faithful have a role in the Mass. And that role is to offer the spiritual sacrifice in their priestly role.
But they don't need to make a sound during that whole...
They don't, because it's an internal disposition, right? But the dialogue is meant to kind of promote that, right? The things we say in Mass is kind of directed towards that priestly ministry. And so Novus Ordo tried to kind of bring that out in a way, put that into better context. So I think the reason why that's such a maybe point of contention is because I think the Novus Ordo is bring that out more in laity. And it was thought that the extraordinary form was really just for the priests and ministers, right? That was just, they did their thing, we'll do our thing out here. When it comes time for communion, we'll come up and receive Jesus. We'll ring the bells, let us know what's happening. Okay, we'll know, right? But that was never the intention. The intention always was the same. It's an internal disposition, active participation of the internal, of your heart and soul, what's happening at the Mass, whether it be the extraordinary form or the Novus Ordo. Now, recently, there's kind of been a controversy the other way. I think we've talked about this before. You guys may have heard this already. But over the summer, the Holy Father promulgated a motu proprio, meaning kind of a directive, that hinders, maybe that's a good way of putting it, the actual promotion of the extraordinary form. To the point where up until July of this past year, if I wanted to celebrate the extraordinary form of the Mass, I could. I'd been given that faculty through my ordination. That faculty was taken away in July, and now in order to celebrate the extraordinary form, that has to be particularly granted by the bishop.
Was it taken away by the bishop?
It was taken away by the Holy Father.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and so now that faculty can only be given by the bishop. The Pope.
Okay.
So, as you may imagine, that's caused a lot of consternation. Now, if you read the motu proprio, his reasoning is actually pretty good. What he says is, never before, even after Trent, even after the Gregorian Mass, there's always been one form of the Mass in Latin Rite. Never before has there been two separate forms. And also, there seems to be a lot of, he was trying to, in his words, counter a lot of the abuses that may happen in the liturgies. What he's, I think, specifically talking about is people that maybe tend to champion the extraordinary form over the Novus Ordo in some ways. Those that go to the extraordinary form often maybe tend to think, I don't think this is necessarily true in majority, but some, and maybe they're more vocal, tend to say the extraordinary form should be the only form of the Mass. The Novus Ordo is invalid or illicit. That's not true, obviously. But that's maybe the thought. And so the reason that the Holy Father, I think, kind of limited it because of that thought, he wants to kind of put that more in line. The critique you may have, I may have, and maybe people have, is that, well, if you're going to critique the abuse in that side, you probably should address the abuse in the Novus Ordo too. Mm. Because we even have priests here in St. Louis that don't actually say the words of the Eucharistic prayer. They'll say the words of consecration, which makes it valid, but they may make up their own words during maybe the collect or other parts of prayer, which also is illicit and an abuse. And in my opinion, if I would think would matter for confession if a priest did that willfully. But he didn't address that. What would make it even more confusing is there was a dubia put out back in October. A dubia is like they're questions raised, like, hey, can you clarify certain things? And I don't think it was any more clear. So there were a lot of questions about, well, wait a minute. So for instance, one of the things that was asked, well, okay, let's say you have a parish that celebrates both forms of Mass. You have proper faculties given, like for instance at St. Luke. At St. Luke the Evangelist over in Richmond Heights, that is also the oratory of Gregory and Augustine, where the extraordinary form is celebrated. So what the dubia said was you have to have, if you're going to have two forms of Mass, you have to have designated space for both of those. So in other words, you can't celebrate the Novus Ordo and the extraordinary form in the same sanctuary or even the same worship space. So what does that mean? Well, if you want to celebrate the extraordinary form, you have to either have a separate chapel or maybe you have a separate place, like a gym or something maybe, I don't know, to celebrate that.
Can't have like a separate altar, like, you know, a side altar.
You can't use the same space, according to the dubia. So it's like, I mean, so that's like the question, why not? Why is this a big deal? I mean, if you have two separate masses, they're not, you know, I don't know. But it causes some consternation and also raises more questions. Okay, well, how do we do that then? Right.
So the issue here with doing Latin Mass at Advent was you had to get permission from the bishop, and then we have to find a separate space.
No. So so we talk about the Rate Caeli Mass, right? That's different. So as I said before, when we came to Vatican II, I can celebrate tomorrow at the 8 o'clock Mass if I wanted to. I can celebrate that Mass all in Latin. Again, that's a Novus Ordo Mass, and that I still have the faculty to do that. Documents allow for that, the German allows for that. I have that faculty. That's different than the extraordinary form of the Mass.
Oh.
Okay? We're talking about two different forms of the Mass. So the extraordinary form I need faculties for, the Novus Ordo I do not. And the Novus Ordo could be celebrated in Latin. That's perfectly allowable. And so the Mass we're planning for December, what we call a Rate Caeli, right? Fall down, you heavens, that's what it stands for. That's actually the antiphon for the Mass. It's a traditional Mass that's celebrated in Advent. It comes from monastic tradition, and it's typically all done in Latin. But it also is a Novus Ordo Mass. It could be extraordinary form, or it could be Novus Ordo, but it could be, we're going to celebrate a Novus Ordo Mass.
So why does it take so long to prepare?
Well, because I teach everyone Latin.
Oh.
That's really the first step. That's really the big challenge. Those who want to participate should probably know the Latin, at least how to pronounce it. And also the planning. We need a lot of candles. We need the trained lectors to actually speak the words. So it takes a little time to plan, and that's why we're taking our time now for this.
You need old people who
Yeah.
studied Latin.
That would be great. That would be great.
And didn't forget it.
And also,
But you remember how to pronounce
I
it.
should also mention this is not like it's not like regular scheduled parish Mass. It's an extra Mass. So you can come, you don't have to come. It's not like if you go to the 8 o'clock Mass on this Friday, we're going to be doing that. No, it's just this is a separate thing altogether. Okay. All right. But yeah, so I think that's the reason why there was such consternation, because it was looked on as different aspects, but both forms are directed for the same thing. The sanctification of man and the glorification of God. That's what the Mass is always directed towards. Right.
I was studying parts of the Mass or something with my 5th grade granddaughter, and the collect.
Collect.
What is that? What is that?
Yeah,
part?
so it actually just like it's the collect. What happens when you collect, right? You bring everything together and offer that to the Father. So the collect is the opening prayer of the Mass. We're taking all the prayers of the faithful and offering that with one voice to the Father to start the Mass. That leads into the liturgy of the Word.
Okay.
Right. So the point of the collect, and so every time you see the priest in this position, we call the orans position. He's acting as the high priest and representative of the people, offering the common prayer of the people to the Father. So you see that about maybe, well, really more like 6 times in Mass. So you see that at the collect. You'll see it after the prayer, after the petitions. You'll see it at the prayer of the offertory, the entire Eucharistic prayer, and then the prayer after communion. So whenever the priest is like this, that's what he's doing.
I mean, we obviously were not pronouncing it correctly.
The
And there was-
collect?
Well, we didn't pronounce it correctly. You know, I mean, she's in 5th grade.
Oh, yeah.
She just wrote the word. And I'm
Yeah.
trying, you know. I'm
Yeah.
And she didn't know what it was. It was just one of the 5,
Mhm.
you know. So it's nice to know how to say it.
Yeah.
So we study again on it.
Yeah, like collection. You're just collecting the prayers of everyone from the Father. That's the point.
That's great.
Yeah.
'Cause
Yeah.
I knew it didn't go with a collection of
Yeah, that's a totally different offering to the Father.
Preparing for the collection of money.
Good, yeah.
So the evolution of Vatican II.
Mm-hmm.
So John the 23rd just woke up one day and said,
It didn't start with John the 23rd.
Oh, it did?
It actually started with Pius X.
okay.
So Pius X was actually called the Reformer Pope. And what Pius X did was actually revise the Liturgy of the Hours. And initially, okay, so you have to almost go back to Vatican I to kind of see how Vatican II came about. So Vatican I actually did pronounce a dogmatic, had a dogmatic pronouncement.
And
When was that?
That was 1854. So does anyone know what the dogmatic pronouncement was from Vatican I?
What year? 1854. 4.
It's interesting because it has a connection with our own Archbishop Kenrick from here in St. Louis. He was kind of a rebel at that council. Well, let me give you a hint. 4 years later, was it Benedict XV? No, not Benedict. Well, this one Pius IX. He promulgated for the first time an infallible statement about the Immaculate Conception. So what gave him that authority to do that? So before that, though, a pope has never made an infallible statement. I should say on his own.
What do you mean by that?
Well, before 1854, the pope has always promulgated the dogmas of councils, right? And so that was what actually made it infallible, that the pope promulgated it. The pope never actually did that on his own, though, until 1858, which was the dogma of the Immaculate Conception. The pope did that on his own, without any talk about it from any other synod or any other council. It's a pretty safe bet, though, because that was something that was promulgated by the church from the 3rd century on. And even the Eastern churches all agree with that, too. But it was the first time that a pope has ever made an infallible statement on his own. And the reason that was granted is because in 1854, Vatican I said that the pope can actually do that. And there were only 2 bishops that did not sign on to that initially. One was our own Archbishop Kenrick, and the other one was the bishop from Little Rock, Arkansas. As a matter of fact, Archbishop Kenrick left the council before he actually signed off on it. They had to hunt him down 4 months later and actually get him to do it. And his rationale was, well, if the council allows him to do it, therefore he can do it. But historically speaking, everything that's come from a council was infallible because the Pope promulgated it. That's always been the tradition of the church. So there's other dogmatic statements made by the Pope, like for instance in 1950, the Assumption of Mary was an infallible statement by the Pope. But what the council also derived from that was that there are only 3 specific criteria where the Pope can actually promulgate something infallible. First, it has to be a matter of faith and morals. So it can't be like if the Pope comes up tomorrow and says, Diet Coke, every good Catholic drink Diet Coke. That's not an infallible statement, right? Faith and morals, in line with the teaching of the church and the magisterium, right? So it has to be, you can't contradict any of the teaching of the church. And then thirdly, it has to be as his office of the Pope, right? Not a matter of opinion. He has to basically be very clear in the fact that I'm saying this as a successor of Peter. And if you read the documents after that, there's certain, any dogmatic statement made is usually has those three criteria specified in the writings. It becomes very clear if it's making a dogmatic statement or not, right? And it also cause some confusion. Like for instance, when Humanae Vitae was promulgated by Paul VI in 1968, there was a lot of people that said this is not dogmatic. But if you read what Paul VI said, especially when he kind of made those statements, was this is in line with Catholic teaching. This is a matter of grave matter, in line with Catholic teaching that I am saying as successor of Peter. But it really wasn't until John Paul II until it actually became more prevalent and more accepted, unfortunately. So, again, the spirit of Vatican II maybe had something to do with that, I don't know. But Vatican I started it. Pius X wanted to have, there was an intention to go have another Vatican Council, because the first Vatican Council was kind of interrupted by this guy named Napoleon. He was kind of causing problems. And so it kind of, after Napoleon kind of went through and did what he did, and everything kind of settled down. Well, Pius IX, when he was, Pius X, when he rose to the throne, then he had these other world wars that came about. There's some other strife, like 1 or 2 world wars. So it wasn't until like after Korea and all that stuff, this stuff kind of died down. It was decided, okay, this is maybe a good time to reconvene the council. So it probably would have been done earlier if they had another conflicts going on in the world. And I think Pius X probably would have done it earlier too if there hadn't been a First World War, a Second World War, and then these other issues. So that's kind of the historical context of where Vatican II came from. But yeah, it really was, so John the 23rd was kind of just taking that from his successors with that plan in mind and saying, okay, let's do it now, right? Yeah.
Is it time for another one?
Well, they usually have one about every century or so. So maybe. If you give, let's say, 1854, 1962, maybe about a couple centuries, or a couple decades maybe. We'll see. Maybe it's a little bit too early this decade, or this century. I think there probably has to be more, I'm not saying the Vatican III, but there probably has to be some more like kind of solidification when maybe came from Vatican II. I think that might be necessary. Now when that happens, that's up to the Holy Father, whatever. So it's above my pay grade, that's all I know. Praise God.
So speaking of churches and where the altars are and the tabernacles are, whatever, does the design firm have to be approved by anyone when they design the church? And who is the final authority to approve the design of the church in accordance with church teachings, church whatever?
Yeah. So there is guidelines as far as construction of a church. So I mean, maybe the first thing to ask is when we talk about construction of a church, Catholic church, what makes it a Catholic church? What do we need to actually say it's a Catholic church?
The name Saint in front of it. I'm kidding.
Well, that's conception.
I don't know, does it, the altar and the blessing of the church?
Altar is necessary.
Crucifix,
Tabernacle, right? No?
blessing.
We said this a couple
Yep,
weeks
at least
ago.
I should know this.
I remember the altar.
Altar is surely necessary.
Yamba?
The communion.
Ambo is surely necessary. Or lectern. I mean, but the ambo would be better. There's a difference between ambo and lectern.
What is it?
An ambo is stationary. And that actually represents, so the ambo represents the tomb of Jesus, as the altar does too. But when the word of God is promulgated from the ambo, that actually represents the angel of the Lord presenting the gospel. So the deacon himself, like when the deacon promulgates the gospel from the ambo, that's actually a more complete symbol of the angel pronouncing the good news from the tomb of Jesus. And so an ambo would be better, but a lectern would do.
Something else. Chairs?
The presider's chair. That's it. So you need a tabernacle. You need an altar, an ambo, and presider's chair.
Is that why you can do it in the house?
Yes. Right. I mean, no. Now, to be fair though, too, they should be consecrated, right? They should be set apart. So, in other words, yeah, here we can have mass down here, but it'd be better. It wouldn't be necessarily church we have down here because these things have not been consecrated for those purposes, right?
So those three things also have to be consecrated.
They should be, right?
And who consecrates them?
The bishop. Always the bishop. So, to your question, Paul, ultimately it depends on who's paying for it. So if the parish is paying for it, they have a lot of autonomy to decide what kind of features can we put in there. Because if it's a parish church, well, the parish can have some say. The pastor has a lot to say. The bishop definitely has the right to say, yeah, you know what? You want to put the tabernacle over here? Let's not do that, right? So yeah, the pastor has a lot of autonomy in those positions. The bishop, though, would have final say on that per canon.
Does he have a committee of learned priests to guide him in that, or?
Yeah, I don't know a priest, but maybe it would be probably wise to gather
Lay people,
architects, that kind of thing. Maybe even church historians or like kind of church experts, like construction experts. So yeah, that would be prudent. Would it be necessary? No. I mean, you hear about a lot of churches here in St. Louis. When they first started, the pastor just kind of got the money and started designing and doing stuff. And they were very beautiful. So I mean, I think it has something to say about beauty in a way, right? That beauty is objective, right? There is a commonality in that you see something beautiful, you know it. And especially in the old construction of those churches, a lot of beauty. A lot of beauty.
Do you have any idea when St. Gabriel changed from the altar next to the tabernacle and brought it out? As a kid, I always thought they used what was there and they cut out, because it used to be solid.
Right.
And then it wasn't. And I thought they used the same thing, but just somehow,
Yeah, I think, I mean, I don't know specifically, but I think sometimes the construction would be actually two parts. Like you'd have the altar of repose where the tabernacle was, and the altar of sacrifice next to it. So usually it were maybe two separate blocks or pieces. Some may have been one. Definitely if they were two, it made it easier to pull it out. Right.
Because I feel like I don't know, I haven't been up close and never paying attention, but there's some things on the altar that seem to be the same when it.
Yeah. Well, and I don't know even necessarily if St. Gabriel was actually designed with the tabernacle up against the altar, actually up against the tabernacle initially. Because if you look at the altar of repose, there's not a lot of space up there.
No, there isn't.
So I would imagine that was actually constructed separately, and that probably could have been around the time when they were thinking about these changes anyway.
Yeah.
So I mean, I know that I think the church was built in 1945.
1950. The
1950.
Cornerstone.
So 50 would have been. I mean, that would have been around that time frame. Of like, well, do we really need it up against the tabernacle? Before that, the chapel was in the school, right?
Right.
I don't know. Maybe they had the tabernacle and the altar together up there. Because that would have been the 1930s, wouldn't it?
Right.
So I don't know.
I was just thinking about it. I'm just curious.
I was going to defer to you.
Where's the cornerstone?
Underneath the.
Yeah, it's on the left. If you're facing the church on the left, down.
By the entrance,
bell
by the
tower.
prayer room.
Oh,
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you refer to the altar of repose, that's the one right below the crucifix?
That's where the tabernacle is.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
Okay, gotcha. That's what I thought.
Yeah. So I don't know if the tabernacle and the altar or whatever went together.
You know what? I think if we had seen wedding pictures from
Well,
the early 50s.
Once in a while, we make a book of and there surely is one of
The
the books,
picture.
and I might have it at home.
It
I'm
shows.
gonna try to find it and see what it looks like.
I know the altar is deeper
Oh, yeah,
Initially.
right, yeah.
because the original altar was this deep,
Oh,
and now the new altar is this deep,
okay.
so there's a seam
Oh,
lengthwise.
okay. Okay.
Oh, yeah, so, yeah, maybe it was, I don't know.
I think it was.
I mean, if it
But
was, it probably wasn't that long. I mean, it probably wasn't there for that long. They probably would have pulled it out.
Well, it wasn't as deep as what it is
Yeah.
now.
I'm gonna try to find it.
Now it's more like a table. Before it was more like
Yeah.
a narrower table.
Yeah, as a kid, it just, I never thought about depth or, I don't know. I just thought they chopped out the.
And the altar cloths didn't fit.
Oh.
They weren't deep enough.
No?
And that makes sense. Usually the altar stone would actually be on the edge of the altar too. You usually like just slide it out. And so, because part of the extraordinary form is the priest would actually venerate the relics in the altar when they would kiss it.
You can't reach it.
Can't reach it now, yeah. So I mean, you could, but it'd be like kind of stretching a little bit.
Get a step ladder.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So how do you know there are 3 relics on the St. Gabriel altar?
I was told that. I don't know for sure. Without, like I said, without actually pulling it out and checking it, I don't know how we would know now. Yeah, for someone knew there were 3, but didn't know which 3.
What do we have in the back?
I think we have like Maria Goretti and there's. I mean, I have to go back. I think maybe Pius the 10th. There's a few back there in the back. They actually have it listed on there who they are. And the relics that are probably in the altar probably the same. They probably have some kind of
Yeah.
label. But that's the only way you know now who they are. Now what they are, that's another story too. I mean, because first class and second class relics could be either part of the saint, something that the saint wore, or something the saint owned. So.
Along that line, when we venerate the cross on, when do we do that? Good Friday. Is what we have any part of the real cross?
The one we've been using recently, no.
Ever?
Well, I don't know, because I know the cathedral actually has a piece of the original cross. Now, but it's often been said that if you take all the relics of the cross and put them together, you probably end up with like 5 crosses. So now Dr. Madden actually talked about this in the church history courses at RCIA, and talked about like the Crusades. At one point, the true cross actually brought into battle in the Crusades. It was lost to the Saladins. Now, what they did with the cross afterwards, nobody knows.
So
It was given back to the Christians later, but it's like, well, is this the original one, or is this what you guys do here? I don't know.
So why do we do that if it's not the true cross?
Well, well, we don't. First off, we don't know any better if it's not, right? So in that respect, it's probably better to stay on the side of caution than not. But the cross, but that veneration is actually okay. It's not the same as worship. We have to be very careful about that, right? Veneration is an honoring. That's different than what we call honorarium would be like what we do the cross and we do with the relics. That's different than latria, which is actually worship that's dedicated just to God, right? But the veneration, we venerate the cross it's a symbolic action of us embracing our own crosses, the way Jesus did, right? We are with Jesus embracing our crosses and also recognize the sacrifice of Jesus himself, which is salvific for us. So in that way, we're kind of being an alter Christus. We're actually mimicking Jesus in his action on the cross. So it's a symbolic action for sure, right? But there's a meaning in that, right? There could be a grace that comes from that. Or I should say, a disposition to receive grace in a deeper way in doing that. Does that make sense? I don't know. It seems like you give me mixed signals here, man. I mean, do you get it? I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure. Does it need more? Do I need more? Give more a little depth of that, or what?
No, it's fine.
Yeah. So it's important to recognize that. We talk about the veneration of the cross on Good Friday. That's where we're venerating the action of Jesus. We're venerating the sacrifice he made for us. And we're doing that in a symbolic action the way that he did, by embracing the cross, kissing it, accepting it.
Well, what about people who go around and touch each one of the stations? Or touch each, the feet of each statue in the shrines?
Yeah.
That wouldn't be as significant as venerating the cross.
I would probably say that's true, but I mean, it's devotional, right? I mean, the other question is, how do you venerate? What is the action of veneration?
Yeah, that's a good question.
So, I mean, is a bow sufficient? Is just a head nod?
A genuflect?
A genuflect?
What is?
I don't think there's a right answer to that. In times of COVID, we found there's many different ways you can venerate, right? I mean, we haven't touched the cross.
With a masturbant.
Right, yeah, right. I mean, I don't think there's necessarily a wrong way. Now, the germ, like we talk about when the priest venerates the altar, there's actually a specific in the germ of how to do that. It actually says with a kiss and with the priest's hands open. But that's more, again, the symbolic action of embracing the tomb of Jesus, right? But you don't necessarily have to. Let's say let's say have lip fungus or something. Well, okay, just bowing to it and touching it, that's fine. That'd be sufficient too. Genuflecting, fine. There's no wrong way to venerate. But the question is, okay, what actually is, either way, they're devotional actions, right? So going around touching the feet of the stations, touching the feet of the statues, that's devotional. There's nothing wrong with that, as long as you're recognizing that's honorarium and not latria, right? Good.
Okay, I've heard that some parishes want to reinstitute the altar railing. Is that?
Nothing wrong with that. Is that what you say? Is that valid or
I
licit?
like it. Well, what do you think about it?
Church still have an altar. I mean, the cathedral does. The old cathedral, new cathedral. My home parish sells an altar rail. Michael Heart Mary. Nothing wrong with that.
And when people go to communion, do they use the altar rail to receive?
At the old and new cathedral, they do. Michael Heart Mary, not so much. You could. Nothing wrong with doing that.
Magdalene, they do.
Yeah.
Some,
Yep.
some do.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this kind of comes down to proper reception of the Eucharist, right? Like, what's a good way? What's a bad way? What's a valid way? What's an invalid way? So what the Bishop Conference of the United States says is that you can receive on the hand or the tongue. Whether you want to kneel, whether you want to stand, whether you want to lie prostrate, well, that's up to you. There's really nothing really says about that. Now, there may be more propriety, and the question there may be, well, are you doing this more as a devotion of what you're receiving, or more as a attention for you? And that needs to be a question that I can't necessarily answer for a person. There's people I think that come here to St. Gabriel and they'll kneel down and receive with them. Okay. And I would imagine they're doing that because they recognize the presence of Jesus in the Eucharist, and good. But if they're doing that because they want to draw attention to themselves, well, that's not so great. Right? But I can't answer that for them. Right? So yeah, I don't think there's necessarily a wrong way to receive, but that's more, again, a question of conscience. Are you doing this because you really have a devotion? Or are you doing this because you want to bring... Is it more about me or about Jesus? I guess that's really the question.
I've noticed some people will only go to communion to the priest.
Okay.
Is that just a personal thing?
I guess. I don't know. I mean, I guess I would say it's Jesus regardless.
Right, exactly.
And so whether you receive it from doesn't make it more Jesus to receive from a priest. It doesn't make it less Jesus to receive from a layperson. It's Jesus. Right? Now, the issue of blessings may come up as far as talk about sacramentals last week. Can a layperson bless? Sure. Does that cause some misconception, confusion if it's done within the liturgy? Yeah. There's even a question about even if a priest should give a blessing in the liturgy. Would that be adding to the liturgy in some way? Because the rubric or the germ does not specify that. It's become kind of a common practice, though, for a priest, if someone can't receive the Eucharist, come up and give them a blessing. Okay? If a layperson does that, is that the same thing? No. Can a layperson do it? Sure. Does the person receiving that really know the difference? Yeah, I don't know. Right? So those are kind of more lacunas and questions within the liturgy and the law that maybe what should be done. Again, Moss, it's been done all over the place forever. I know the Archbishop even does that at the cathedral when people come up, they can't receive the. I don't know.
Well, people who are carrying little kids, the little kid gets the blessing.
Yeah, but the question is, like I said, the question should be that even be done by a priest, even a priest or a deacon doing that. Is that adding to the liturgy? Where the germ really expressly forbids adding to the liturgy. But is it? I mean, there's something liturgical in nature about it. There's something theological behind it. It's like, it's interesting when couples come for marriage prep and get married. There's a new revision of the rites that came out in 2016. And so anyone maybe who went to a mass prior to 2016, maybe you'll have experience of like, I don't know, a unity candle, or maybe like, now they do like the sand, or now there's something about glass they I don't know what it is. But they do these kind of like, rites within the rite kind of thing, like these kind of symbolic actions or whatever. Well, the new rite explicitly says no to all that. Right? And so you'll have couples like, can we do the candle? No. There's nothing theological behind that. But, could they bring roses to the Blessed Mother altar?
That's not part of it either, huh?
No, well, technically it's not.
Well, can they do it after Mass?
Sure, you can do anything after Mass. I don't care about that. But when you try to do within the liturgy, it's like, well, I mean, there's something like devotional nature about that, and there's a theology behind that. So, is that adding to the liturgy or not?
Have the candles, lighting the candles and stuff stopped?
Oh, yeah.
I guess I haven't paid any attention.
Since about 2016, yeah, for sure.
They still go to the Mary statue.
So here's the thing, I've allowed that because I'm like, yeah, I can see that being fine. Am I going to be put in liturgy jail? Maybe, I don't know, right? Because I mean it's not expressly given by the rite. But also it's like I think there's a beautiful moment about that though too. You can make an argument either way, I think. So yeah, it's kind of the same thing though. It's like, well, what is actually adding to the liturgy? That's a big question.
Well, if it's not adding to the liturgy, you're not supposed to do it. But if it's not adding to the liturgy, then it doesn't.
Yeah, that's the problem, right? Well, that's the question. That's the real question. Is it or isn't it? I don't know. I mean,
That's no different. Anybody with a pulse can baptize somebody.
True.
So.
But see, the thing is, that's specifically granted by law. That's specified in law that anyone can baptize. Right?
Yeah.
So it's a little different than, okay, God bless you. I don't
No wonder
know.
it takes so long to get out of the seminary. You have to learn all that stuff.
And then relearn it.
And not even everything. Like this question, like I can't remember how many times these things are brought up in our liturgy classes. Like even the thing about we were going through our practicum and our practice for for matrimony. These questions, I was like, what about this? Because the instructor's like in the same boat. Like, well, I mean, do whatever you feel prudent. I mean, that's one of the answers you're given. Is like, okay, great, What makes it even more interesting is that now it's actually specific in the rite. And this was a question when we talk about marriage, when we do marriage practicum. In the new rite, there are certain things that are allowed, like what they call the eros and the lasso. You guys ever hear these things? Yeah. I did it one time. I've only done it one time. And the reason is because this apparently comes from a Latin American tradition. That there is a part of the rite is that the godparents would come up and they would take a chain or a rope and wrap them around this rope, symbolizing their covenantal bond. And the rope is blessed, they're given a blessing by the priest. And then at the end of, I think it's at the end after communion, I go back and look at it, but they give what they call aras, which is like coins to each other, which represents like prosperity and wealth. And those are also blessed by the priest. That's in the rite now. That wasn't in there prior to 2016. So the question, of course, is, well, this is a Latin American tradition. What if you have two Anglos that want to do this? Is that cool? Because it's in the rite. And the answer we got was no. Why not? Well, that's a cultural thing. If they come from a culture that celebrates that, sure. But if not, but there's no specification in the rite about that.
Well, at one point it had been a cultural thing to light the unity candle.
Correct.
Good point.
But see, you're absolutely right. But now the rite specifically says none of that stuff.
So they could do that about the Latin American
Because in the rite it actually specifies for the lasso and the aras.
But they could change that. That could
Well,
be
they
changed.
could, but it's taken, what, 1970 was the last book came out. What was this, 45 years? So, okay, I'll probably be dead by the next time they come to revision, so I don't care. But that's what I'm saying. That's actually now in there, where it wasn't before. So, okay, that's allowed, but wait a minute, hold on. Unless that's part of your culture, you should only do that.
What was the book in 1945 that said all this? What did you just say?
So 1970 was when all the liturgical books changed.
Right.
And so this new revision came out in 2016.
I mean, is there a box somewhere that all these questions go, and then when the next one comes out, those get
So
addressed?
that's a good question. There is a congregation at the Vatican of divine worship, to which these questions are kind of given. But like anything in Rome, especially, or the Vatican, or in the church in general,
Slow.
it doesn't come out pretty rapid. It's not very efficient.
Couple centuries of these.
Maybe. Most people hope for a couple decades, right? Yeah. Because, I mean, primarily, a lot of these questions, they have to be researched. They kind of have to be, like, weighed. They have to be prayed with. I mean, it's not like a quick and dirty, yeah, do that, fine.
Decision.
Okay, it shouldn't be, right? It shouldn't be a quick and dirty, go do that. So it's not as quick as we would like. And so, yeah, these are probably all collected at some point, and the next revision of the rite, I'm sure they'll address some of that thing, and then I'll be long dead if that happens, so fine.
So when the godparents, is there 4 godparents come out? If they're alive, they come out?
What it says is, it doesn't have to be godparents, it says could be, the rite says could be godparents or another influential couple, for the person for the couple or for the person, right?
My daughter had coins in 10 years ago because she married a Cuban, but
Yeah.
I'm glad we didn't have ropes, chains.
Yeah. And or it could be a veil. I mean, just basically they wrap it around the couple. There's a blessing. They take it off, and I think actually they keep it on there until like communion. They take it off. It's a very It was interesting. I mean, like I said, the only time I had it, the bride was Mexican, and so because she was Mexican, great, we did it. But like, as the first time I ever did it, maybe the only time I ever do it, I don't know. Let's see. But yeah, it's only for that particular Latin American culture.
I'm gonna have to ask, because the coins came from an aunt and uncle.
Yes. Yeah.
So it was passed down.
Right.
I don't know if they weren't passing down chains or ropes or veils, so I'll have to ask if they did that part.
You probably would have seen it. I mean, it would be pretty evident.
Oh, well,
Yeah.
it was my daughter. I would have, known
Right.
it was part of it, but I knew
Yeah.
about the coins. But that's interesting.
But that was before it's actually explicit in the
Yes,
rite.
right, yeah.
So again, I mean, it could have been it could like take place like the unity candle or whatever too. I mean, that could have been. But yeah, it's usually when we make these changes, a lot of question comes out initially. It's like, okay, because like I said, we were asking these questions too, and it's like, no, you can't do that. Well, why not? It's in the rite. If I had two, English people who wanted to do this, what's my argument? Well, it's not really cultural. I mean, today you probably made the argument it's cultural appropriation or whatever, fine.
That's so interesting.
But it's in the rite. If they really want to push me on it, I'd be like, all right.
So what if I did something they changed in the next book, then that made I'm not in the wrong because
No.
it was okay when.
Yeah, your grandfather.
and
There's
then
there's grandfather policy
Yeah.
to those two. I mean, so like that's what I'm saying. And again, it doesn't invalidate anything, right? So when it comes to marriage and these things, the only thing that can invalidate the marriage is the couple that's making the vows, right? Everything else is just it's symbolic in nature. It's not essential. It's like at the Eucharist, the only person who can actually make the mass invalid is the priest, right? Everything else can go completely wrong. But if the priest doesn't say, this is my body and this is the chalice of my blood, it's not the Eucharist. Those are the only things that the priest has to say. Everything else can be bleh. As long as the matter is valid and the priest says those words, it's the Eucharist. Same thing in confession. If the priest screws up the absolution, guess what? You're not absolved. Sorry. By desire you could be, I suppose, right? Fine. But the sacrament is not valid.
What if you don't know that the priest?
Yeah, I was gonna say, what if you don't know the?
Yeah, I
Well,
wouldn't know.
so as long as the priest says, I absolve you in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit,
Oh,
you are absolved.
okay.
But how about earlier when you said the priest couldn't say, some of them are bringing other words into, are you?
Yeah, that's why I was wondering.
What I mean is, like, let's say, okay, let's say the Eucharistic prayer, so the priest starts, to you, Lord, rainfall comes down, and the Spirit comes and addresses you, Lord, and brings you to things. And at his Last Supper, he took some bread, and he broke it, and gave it to his buddies. And then he said, this is my body. And then after dinner, he said, he took some wine, poured it in a cup or something, and then he gave it to the disciples and said, this is the chalice of my blood. Valid? Yes. Illicit? Is it licit? No. Incredibly illicit. But still Jesus. Right? So yeah, I mean, obviously, a priest, what should I say? I don't want to a priest should do it right. Right? And if they don't do it right willfully, they should bring out confession. That's just how it should be. Yeah. Good.
So I have a quick question.
Wonderful.
I don't want to bring up old wounds, but during this whole priest and youngster scandal,
Okay.
if a priest knew he had just come out of bed with one of these young men and said mass, valid mass?
Yeah,
Valid
because
consecration?
so valid because the sanctity of the sacrament does not depend on the minister. Right. The sacrament is by the act itself is sanctified, right? We call that opere operato, right? So that by the work worked, it's grace giving. That's different than opere operantis, right? That there's certain things that because of the sanctity of the church provides sanctity through certain actions, but in the sacraments they're opere operato, meaning that by the sacrament being done, it is grace giving. So yeah, now a priest should, though, in order not to compound the sin, make a perfect act of contrition before celebrating the Mass. So yeah, there is a distinction. So in order to receive the Eucharist, you should be in a state of grace, right? Well, priests, because of who they are, they may not be. Yet they still have an obligation to celebrate the Mass for the people. And so if they haven't had a chance to go confession, they should make a perfect act of contrition before celebrating the Mass. They still have to go to confession, don't get me wrong. They still have to do that. But for laicity, they should do that. Right? For validity, as long as they say the words, it is Jesus.
What's a perfect act of contrition?
So a perfect contrition would be that I'm sorry for my sins because of I love God and I offended him. An imperfect act of contrition would be I'm sorry for my sins because I fear the punishment that comes from that.
Oh.
So in confession, imperfect is all that's necessary, right? All that's required. But for salvation, like let's say you walk out of confessional after doing your penance, and you sin right away, right? Let's say you shoot a guy, whatever it is, and you're sorry, but you're sorry because, oh man, I might go to hell to get hit by a bus. That wouldn't necessarily be sufficient for you to go to heaven, right? But if you're sorry because, well, I love God and God loves me above all things and I offended God, and I'm sorry because of that, that's a perfect contrition. So for the sacrament, imperfect is necessary, but otherwise perfect would be required.
Another quick question.
Great.
So recently, and in the last number of years, when many people say the Our Father during Mass, they raise their hands like this.
Sure.
Why do we do that?
Yeah, maybe that's also the spirit of Vatican II.
Some don't.
Well, I know most people don't, but some
Well,
people
okay,
do.
what does that action signify?
Well, it signifies to me that I'm opening myself up to
All right.
the Lord, and as I'm praying to Him, I want to.
What does that also look like, though?
Looks like the priest.
Yes. So again, as we established, what does this position mean?
The collection of prayers.
The priest is acting as the high priest in persona Christi, offering prayers to the Father, right? So the priest can do that by grace of ordination. Now, if someone does that during the Our Father, it doesn't mean they're trying to mimic the priest in that action. Again, a lot of this comes down to your disposition. Is it wrong? No. Is it liturgically improper? Yeah,
Really?
it kind of is. Because you're mimicking. You're doing the same action of the priest as a high
I thought
priest.
you were supposed to do that. The deacon's wife and daughter does that, and I sit next to them all the time. That's why I did it.
Tell my wife that.
Like you said, now it's like things like holding hands. Like holding hands during Our Father. There's nothing wrong with that. No, not necessarily. But there's nothing saying that you should or shouldn't do that. But this action is a priestly action. That's a priestly position.
I think at one point in time that was encouraged.
Yeah, probably
I don't know when, but-
probably after Vatican II, right?
Probably.
Yeah. Spirit of Vatican II. There it is. Wonderful.
So now it's discouraged.
I wouldn't say it's either encouraged or discouraged. It's just, because here's the thing: if you're doing this legitimately, like this is an act of me offering myself to God, that's legit. There's nothing wrong with doing that. But what the problem is, it could cause confusion, right? Because who's the priest here? This is a liturgical action, and liturgical action of the priest.
But see, we didn't know that till you said it.
Granted, hey, okay, here's the thing. I'm not saying it's a matter of confession, Marilyn. I'm not saying it's really an issue with that at all. I'm just saying that there's liturgical propriety, there's liturgical impropriety. And there's degrees of that, right? I mean, so I'm not saying that's not a huge liturgical issue. It's not like you're going to be put in liturgical prison for doing that, right?
Not even time out.
Not even time.
Not even-
Right.
What about the liturgy police?
But it's important, but it's important to recognize what every action we have in Mass has a meaning. And we have to understand what those actions are, what the meanings are behind those things. Our disposition does matter, right? I mean, the Mass is an action, right? Our position, the way we sit, stand, those have a meaning and a purpose. Right? So yeah, people do it now. I really don't really recognize. I don't really see it anymore. But I mean, yeah, it is. But yeah, that's again the priest as persona Christi often offering that prayer to God the Father, in representing the people. And even when we're saying it all together, the priest is still doing that action on behalf of the people.
Is there any proper way that one should be with your hands, either you fold them or you during Mass? I mean.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, a prayerful position at all times. I mean, so we told the servers when they're sitting down, they should have their hands folded in their lap, right? And again, it depends on what's going on in the Mass. So, when we're sitting down, that's its position of receptivity. We're receiving the Word of God, right? When we're standing, that's a position of honor, right? when we're kneeling, that's actually a position of latria. We're giving actually worship to God, right? And so those positions all have a meaning. And so now, yeah, I mean, so it kind of reminds me of, like, you ever see Talladega Nights? You ever see that video of you, like, I don't know what to do with my hands, right? You know? And so, I mean, so, yeah, there's nothing wrong with always having your hands in prayer position or at your side, or, you know, in some respectful position will always be appropriate, right? Preferably not, like, you know, flashing gang signs or, you know, that kind of thing. That'd be nice. But yeah, I mean, I think our body should actually represent what we're doing, right? So yeah, there's no, like, rubric or necessarily, like, guidance on that, but hands folded is always good. Hands in your lap is always fine too.
But there is guidance on when to stand and when to kneel and when to sit.
Correct. And again, those all are telling what's actually happening in the Mass, in the liturgy. Notice it doesn't say sleeping anywhere. Doesn't say anywhere sleeping anywhere in the liturgy. Doesn't say anywhere to sleep. But I mean, some people might. Homily might get a little long. I don't know. Who knows?
Now those directions are for us Americans. Like in Europe, when there's no pews, they don't kneel.
They stand. Yeah, they stand. Right. Yeah. Well, even in the United States, the direction is to stand, like, so, like, kneeling, for instance, kneel or sit. So it says, like, during the Eucharistic prayer, it's appropriate to kneel, sit. Now, part of that is like, well, if you can't kneel, sitting's fine. But the reason being is that, you know, during that moment where Jesus is becoming present at the altar, we should be below him, right? We should be in a disposition to show that due respect and honor what's happening, right? And a lot of that comes down to different bishop conferences, but I think in general the germ is pretty specific about those things. Yeah, wherever you are, it depends on the circumstances. So if you don't have kneelers, yeah, okay, we're going to have chairs. Well, I mean, they're kind of limited there. You're not going to, you know, sit on the floor. I guess you could, but that's kind of sick. You know, who knows? You know where the floor's been or is cleaned at last, you know, that kind of thing. So it depends on the circumstances too. And part what germ does specify is you take into consideration in your dispositions.
Well, for instance, when the kids had Mass out on the parking lot, I didn't get to attend any of them, but did they stand and sit and kneel?
They stand, yeah. Now usually, I think they were bought like towels, which sit on the towels, which is fine. Yeah, but they kneel. Well, I guess I don't think they were doing much of that out there. They could have, I guess, but you know, also you're talking about blacktop, so. Maybe the more devout ones did. I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't really pay that much attention. I haven't had Mass out there at all this year, so praise God. I don't like that. I'd rather take
well, and then Mass in the grass too.
Mass, yeah, right. Well, Mass in the grass. I mean, people still kneel for that. I mean, that's grass though too. It's a little different than blacktop, so a little more cushion. But even then, I mean, like I said, the rubric is very clear about if you can't kneel, you can sit. Good. Okay, well, it's about 8 to 8, so unless there are any other questions, we can wrap it up. And we'll see you next week, if not sooner. All right, thanks for coming, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good talk, Father.
Yeah, always good.
Yeah.